This is part two of the lecture on queer history. So I left off talking about the Daughters of Bilitis and the homophile movement, and now I want to move on to talking about gay liberation, lesbian feminism, and transgender liberation. Let's see. Okay. So before moving on to a discussion of the riots at the Stonewall Inn, I think it's important to note that the Stonewall Riots were not the first riots, as you know from the reading by Susan Stryker. For example, in 1966, in San Francisco's Tenderloin District, there was a similar riot at Compton's cafeteria. I'm not going to play a clip from this documentary, but if there's an entire documentary about the Compton's cafeteria riot that was made by Susan Stryker. It's called Screaming Queens, and you can find it online for free pretty easily. So historian Susan Stryker argues that there were other incidents of resistance by trans people, like at Cooper's Donuts in 1959, at Dewey's in Philadelphia in 1965, but that the riot at Compton's cafeteria is significant because it resulted in lasting institutional change. In other words, it sparked organizing for trans and queer rights in San Francisco, and as such was not just a singular event, but part of a larger movement that was just emerging by the mid to late 1960s. But it is true that the Stonewall Riots stand out in queer history because it was after the riots that the movement for gay liberation spread across the country. So I'm not going to play this on this video, but there's a drunk history clip with Marcia Johnson that's about Marcia Johnson that you can find online. So what were the Stonewall Riots? Early in the morning on June 28, 1969, police conducted a raid at the Stonewall Inn. It was a gay bar in New York's Greenwich Village, which attracted a variety of people: drag queens, lesbians, trans people, gay men, street hustlers, and so on. It also drew a racially mixed crowd, including white people, African Americans, and Puerto Ricans. The police raid on the Stonewall Inn sparked a riot or rebellion that lasted 4 whole days. The Stonewall Inn had been raided numerous times previously, but a new spirit in the late 1960s infused the queer bar patrons with a spirit of rebellion. So in other words, a context of social upheaval, the various social movements that were active in the late 60s inspired queer people to revolt as well. So the Stonewall, scholars and activists often mark the riot as the beginning of the movement for gay liberation. So how did the riot begin? When the police arrived and started arresting people, the crowd that gathered outside started tossing coins and cobblestones at the police. And then accounts differ about what happened next. Some witnesses claim that a white butch lesbian, or a masculinely dressed lesbian, resisted police attempts to put her in the paddy wagon, while others noted that African American and Puerto Rican members of the crowd, many of them transgender or feminine gay men, grew increasingly angry as they watched their sisters being arrested and escalated the level of violence. So as the situation escalated, members of the crowd started throwing bottles and rocks at the police, and the police retaliated violently by beating people. Sylvia Rivera, alongside Marcia P. Johnson, both leading activists for transgender liberation, they participated in the riot. So the Stonewall Riots lasted 4 nights, helped to politicize large segments of the queer community in New York and then nationally. So Stonewall is often talked about because it's credited as the spark for the gay liberation movement. So this is a documentary about the Stonewall Riots that you can watch easily. Again, you can easily find it online using the streaming services through the ARC library or on Amazon or YouTube. So Gay Liberation Fronts, this group called the Gay Liberation Front, they were formed in cities, towns, and colleges across the United States after the riots in June of 1969. The Gay Liberation Front modeled itself after Third World, people of color, liberation and anti-war and anti-imperialist movements in the period. So it's key, right, to understand that there were other organizations, mainly led by people of color, that called themselves liberation fronts. The Gay Liberation Front, or the GLF, defined its politics as radical. So in addition to challenging homophobia, the GLF had an intersectional analysis and challenged larger systems of oppression including imperialism, capitalism, and racism, most prominently. The politics of gay liberation activists were different from the political leanings of the earlier homophile or gay rights movements. Gay liberation movement activists were not satisfied with merely securing employment rights and freedom from harassment in the gay ghetto. They essentially wanted to destroy the image of gay people as sick, as sissies. They wanted to show the world that being gay was okay, and their slogan was "Gay is good." The year 1969, the Stonewall Riot, marked a transition from this earlier, more moderate form of political organizing, homophile organizing, to a more radical and vocal kind of organizing for gay and lesbian, bisexual, and transgender rights. In many ways similar to what was happening in other social movements in the late 60s, the early 70s, as they're becoming increasingly more radical in their demands. So divisions arose within the GLF almost immediately. There were more conservative gay activists, or more moderate, I should say, gay activists who criticized the GLF for its radicalism, and they formed a group called the Gay Activists Alliance, which felt like activists should focus narrowly on gay rights and changing laws, so smaller reforms, or I should just say reforms, they're not necessarily small reforms, rather than stirring up revolution. So in contrast to the GLF, the Gay Activists Alliance largely refused to take on sexism and racism in the organization, and thus it consisted largely, though not exclusively, of gay white men. So let's take a closer look at lesbian feminism and transgender liberation. Lesbian feminism emerged at the intersection of two different movements, gay liberation and women's liberation. So it was influenced by both movements. So this quote by Linda Gordon, I think, sums up or describes lesbian feminism well. Okay, women's liberation contributed mightily to the large-scale coming out of lesbians through shattering assumptions about what was natural in sex, in love, in family, and by viewing marriage as an option rather than a necessity. By disrupting the myths about women's sexual desire and pleasure, it deposed the penis from its position as necessary for women's sexual pleasure. Thus, women's liberation created the political context that helped to empower not only women in general, but lesbians in particular, to question gender and sexual norms and organize for their own rights. And lesbians involved in the gay liberation front found that their voices, and thus their issues, weren't being given serious consideration by the men in the group. Right? This is something that's happening in other mixed gender organizations in the 60s and the 70s as well. So men in the gay liberation front thought themselves the intellectual leaders of the group and spoke more frequently and louder than everybody else. Women, once again, were expected to do things like pass out leaflets and make coffee. This is what we hear repeatedly of the movements of the 60s and 70s. So in reaction, lesbians around the country began to form their own organizations. They also formed their own communes. That's another story, including one group called Radical Lesbians in New York City. One of the first actions organized by radical lesbians was an intervention into the women's liberation movement. So not everybody in women's liberation was accepting or inclusive of lesbians and their issues. In 1970, for instance, the second Conference to Unite Women didn't have a single panel that addressed lesbianism. Betty Friedan, one of the most widely recognized leaders of women's liberation, actually referred to lesbians as the quote-unquote lavender menace. She was concerned that the broader, more conservative society would dismiss women's liberation if it was associated with lesbians, and thus she tried to distance women's lib from lesbian feminism. Should be noted, though, that Betty Friedan came around in later years. She would reject these earlier views, but this is what she's promoting early on. So lesbian activists organized to convince women's liberation activists to address homophobia. At this conference in 1970, lesbians wore t-shirts that read, quote-unquote, lavender menace, and refused to permit the conference to go on if it continued to ignore lesbians and lesbian rights, and they were quite successful in their efforts. So this is an image of the conference. This is Rita Mae Brown, who wrote Ruby Fruit Jungle, a novel published in 1973, which was widely read. It was quite popular in part because of its explicit discussion of lesbian sex. The plot centered around the coming-of-age story of a young woman realizing she's a lesbian. So Ruby Fruit Jungle is a really kind of now a classic in lesbian literature, one of the first most widely read novels that actually addresses lesbianism. Women in Radical Lesbians authored a pamphlet called The WomanIdentified Woman. So I'll read this quote. What is a lesbian? A lesbian is the rage of all women condensed to the point of explosion. She is the woman who, often beginning at an extremely early age, acts in accordance with her inner compulsion to be a more complete and freer human being than her society cares to allow her. These needs and actions over a period of years bring her into painful conflict with people, situations, the accepted ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving, until she is in a state of continual war with everything around her, and usually with herself. On some level, she has been able to accept the limitations and oppression laid on her by the most basic role of her society, the female role. So many radical lesbians promoted what they called political lesbianism. Radical lesbians argued that women should separate themselves from men and adopt lesbianism as a political choice rather than just a personal choice. This way, they could claim their humanity as women away from the oppressive intimate relationships with men. This pamphlet, The WomanIdentified Woman, argued that any woman was first and foremost a woman identified that any woman who was first and foremost a woman-identified woman could consider herself a lesbian. Thus, lesbianism became a political choice rather than simply a form of sexuality. So there were criticisms by lesbians of color of lesbian separatism, as it became known, because it attracted a disproportionate number of white lesbians. It was less easy or desirable for lesbians of color to completely separate themselves from non-lesbian identified women and men of the same race or ethnicity, thereby breaking down the bonds of racial solidarity that helped to fortify them in a white racist society. So founded in 1970, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, which I'll refer to as STAR, would become one of the most influential transgender rights groups during the period of gay liberation and trans liberation. So you know about this group from the reading, so I might skip some of this rather than just repeat what you know from the reading, but STAR is an important organization to know about, one of the leading organizations for trans rights in the early 1970s. Its main leaders were Sylvia Rivera and Marcia Johnson. They both identified as street transvestites. You know, they were often homeless. They had to be sex workers to survive. So Marcia Johnson was an African-American woman, while Sylvia Rivera was Puerto Rican and Venezuelan descent. Sylvia Rivera, who was on the street at the young age of 11, when she met Marcia Johnson for the first time. Marcia was 17 years old, also essentially living on the streets. So STAR formed, according to Sylvia Rivera, because of the problems found in groups like the Gay Liberation Front and Gay Activist Alliance, which refused to take seriously issues of concern to people who identified as trans and in fact could often be quite disrespectful. Sylvia Rivera remarked, quote, "We formed STAR because my brothers and sisters kept using us when they needed us, but they weren't treating us fairly, so we wanted to be by ourselves." Marcia noted, quote, "If a transvestite doesn't say, 'I'm gay and I'm proud and I'm a transvestite,' then nobody else is going to hop up there and say, 'I'm gay and I'm proud and I'm a transvestite' for them." Coming as it did out of the gay liberation movement, STAR supported gay liberation's call for revolutionary transformation of a host of institutions it considered oppressive, including oppression in the schools, corporate capitalism, the nuclear family, prisons, the police force, the legal system, oppression within and by churches, and so on. So STAR organized primarily around issues pertinent or important to mostly young transgender youth forced to live and work on the streets. for survival after running away from home for being kicked out of their homes because of the fact that they were transgender. So Star House, they formed a group. They had a house called Star House, which existed from around November 1970 to July 1971, so not a very long time. But it was important because it was the first communal shelter on record that explicitly served transgender kids living on the streets. It provided basic sustenance and emotional support, but it also served as a base for political organizing. So the significance of STAR, of Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, is that it marks the emergence of a broader trans liberation movement, which would grow in strength and become much more prominent, of course, in the 1990s and 2000s, as you know. It also reflected a larger theme in queer history, one in which trans people fought for their rights to be taken seriously and included by other queer activists. So queer people of color also formed their own organizations, feeling like the largely white spaces, like radical lesbians, the spaces created by lesbian feminists more generally, weren't as inclusive of their needs. So there's groups like, on this slide, the Gay Latino Alliance, which was active from the mid-70s to the early to mid-80s. So this is an important organization because it's one of the first groups explicitly led by people who identified as gay, trans, and Latino. So it was mainly an organization for men, though there were some lesbians also involved, as well as transgender women or gender nonconforming queer folks. So the Combahee, or I guess it's pronounced Combahee River Collective, existed from 1974 to 1980. This was an organization for Black lesbians in particular, and the Combahee River Collective is particularly important because it offered up this concept of intersectionality. It criticized this idea that lesbians should separate off from men in the entirety of their lives. So they are some of the first to theorize around this concept of intersectionality. So there's lots of successes of the movement in general. There's the Supreme Court's 2003 decision in Lawrence v. Texas that finally determined that states could not make gay sex illegal. There's also the Supreme Court decision in 2015, I think it's pronounced Obergefell or Burgerfell v. Hodges, which made same-sex marriage legal and made it illegal, in other words, for states to pass anti-gay marriage laws. We also see, the development of queer studies and history as a field of study beginning in the late 1970s and 1980s. And gradually you have the repeal of anti-cross-dressing laws state by state and numerous legislative victories. So I just want to end by reiterating the 2 points I started with. Number one, the treatment of queer people, lesbians, gay people, bisexuals, pansexuals, transgender people, and other queer identified people during the 20th century in the U.S. has not simply been one of progress, gradual progress. It's more complex than that. Resistance to homophobia and transphobia was not invented suddenly in the 1960s, but it was then that we saw massive collective resistance by queer people who, for the first time, were coming out of the closets, demonstrating and demanding their rights as never before.